I'm Lisa Stone, and you're listening to Parenting Aces. Welcome to Season 9 of the Parenting Aces podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Stone, and in this week's episode, we're talking about a new racket sport that has emerged on the scene. It's called spec tennis, and it is not the same as pickleball. It is not the same as paddle tennis. It's something new. And the creator of spec tennis, Nate Gross, emailed me a while back and said, hey, want to tell you about this new sport I've created that is a way to actually grow tennis. And of course, I was intrigued and am really happy to be able to bring you a conversation that I just had with Nate talking about spec tennis and how it can be used with junior players and also with adult players to kind of bridge the gap with tennis itself and to also be used as a supplement when a player is trying to learn a new skill or trying to really hone in on a new skill on the tennis court. Spec tennis is a way to kind of break that skill down into more manageable pieces and help the player actually get better at the individual components of that new stroke or new shot before taking it out onto the tennis court. So I'm thrilled to bring you Nate Gross coming from Northern California, talking about spec tennis. I hope you enjoy, and be sure, as always, to check the show notes for any links to information that we're sharing in our conversation. For now, sit back, relax, and enjoy learning about spec tennis. Nate Gross, thank you so much for joining us on the Parenting Aces podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. I think my recording platform has changed its format a little bit because I hit record and was waiting for the lady to tell us we were recording, and she never told us. But it's showing that we're recording, so I think we're good to go here. So I want to just start out, as I do with anybody coming on the Parenting Aces podcast for the first time, and ask you to tell us your tennis story. How did you get started in the sport?
I got started in the sport. I grew up in Sonoma County, California, and my dad got me into tennis. He'd played racket sports for most of his life, and just saw that I took to tennis a little bit more than other sports. I played everything growing up, but just had a little bit more ability in tennis. And so I played through juniors, ended up playing in college. And after college, still had that passion and love of tennis. And so I started getting into coaching.
Where did you play in college?
I played at Idaho State University.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Well, so my son played a year at Boise State. So same conference, I think.
A little bit. Boise's in a little bit better conference, and they were always we always admired going to their campus and playing against them in the tournaments and things like that.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous campus for sure. And so now you are kind of getting involved in a new type of racket sport that you are promoting as a way to grow tennis. And the new racket sport is called spec tennis. And I'd love for you to tell our audience what spec tennis is and how you see it having a positive impact on tennis as a whole.
Yes, absolutely. So spec tennis is played on a pickleball court, but can also be played on a variety of other surfaces and courts. So you can play in the service boxes on a tennis court. You can play on a gym floor, on just any asphalt or clay surface. You use an orange dot low compression tennis ball, with which many people are familiar with for 10 and under tennis. And then it's an 18-inch paddle with holes in it that is similar to a platform tennis paddle that you might see on the East Coast.
Gotcha.
And by bringing the sweet spot of the paddle closer to the hand and using the smaller court and the slower ball, this creates the environment for great success and a lot higher engagement, especially when players are starting out in tennis. Because as we know, tennis is pretty difficult to get good at, and so you have to be pretty committed early on. And I've found that with coaching tennis myself, you have so many other things that you have to compete with, especially for kids. There's a lot of activities that they could be doing instead of tennis. And so I find that's really important to be able to keep them engaged and having the most fun from day one so that they stay in the sport and they learn to love it.
So what's the difference between spec tennis, pickleball, platform tennis? There's a form of short court tennis we used to play when I was in college out here in California, and I'm drawing a blank as to what it was called, but basically,
I think you're referring to pop tennis.
Yes.
Great. So I'll give a brief comparison of all of those. So spec tennis is played on the pickleball court, but that's the only similarity to pickleball. Pickleball uses a solid paddle in a wiffle ball that is plastic with holes in it. One of the main components of pickleball is the no volley zone. And so this basically leads to, in most points, all players getting up about 7 feet from the net and hitting a series of drop shots called dinks, because they aren't allowed to step forward and volley like they would in tennis. So in spec tennis, that rule is not observed. And so when watching people play, it looks just like you're playing tennis. In terms of a comparison to platform tennis, that's played in a cage. So there's a chicken wire fence around the court. The ball is very lively. So I compare it to kind of a lacrosse ball and a racquetball combination. The ball can hit the cage before you play it. And so there's the use of the cage as a main component of that. In terms of pop tennis, that is played on a 60-foot court. So the pickleball court is 44 feet. Pop tennis is 60 foot. They play with a green dot tennis ball or a dead tennis ball that you puncture with a needle. And with the slower ball, the less powerful paddle, and the smaller court, that creates the environment for longer rallies, in my opinion, than you might get in pop tennis. And then the pickleball court is a great court size because you can fit 4 of them on a tennis court. So if you wanted to fit potentially 16 players playing doubles on one tennis court, you could have that with spec tennis or pickleball, but you couldn't have that with pop tennis.
And why spec tennis as opposed to, let's say, red ball tennis that's also played on a shorter court with a low compression ball?
That's a great question. So I personally love the transition balls, and I use them every day in my teaching, the red, orange, green, and yellow ball, obviously. But I think that there's a stigma attached to it. A lot of people just kind of categorize it as kids tennis, and there's many adults out there that could benefit from training with those balls with more junior size equipment. They could definitely benefit their tennis game, but just it's hard to get over that stigma that, oh, I'm playing kids tennis. I want to play the real thing. And so I find that when you start introducing junior equipment to adults, it's a little bit harder for it to catch on. Whereas with spec tennis, everybody uses the same equipment, so there is no kids version of it. So the kids are using the same size paddle and ball and court as the adults.
Interesting. I mean, I get that, it's a quick entry level, or not quick entry level, but a quick entry into the sport with spec tennis just based on the equipment and the size of the court and everything. But I guess what I'm not as clear on is how spec tennis is going to lead to people coming to tennis and, where the crossover is. Because I think one of the things we've seen with pickleball is it's actually taking people away from tennis. It's a separate sport. It's not an adjunct sport or a transition into tennis. Rather, it's its own separate entity. And it seems to me, just based on, again, the type of equipment and the size of the court, that spec tennis is also its own entity. It's a separate sport, but maybe you can help me understand the crossover a little bit better.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I 100% agree with those points that you're making. Spec tennis can be its own entity, and for some players, they might be better off doing spec tennis or doing pickleball. There's just some people that aren't going to enjoy lifetime playing tennis as others, but it can also be used as a bridge into tennis. And I think with pickleball making it more difficult to attract tennis players, due to the difference in difficulty. You can get somebody that's just watching somebody play pickleball, they invite them out there and suddenly they're able to play. That's not the case with tennis. You need a lot of work before you're able to rally with somebody else. And so I think spec tennis is really providing that bridge. And so I'll give you some examples of how you could use it as a bridge to tennis, but also how you can cross-train for tennis with it.
Okay.
So for example, you could take any skill that you want to work on in tennis and kind of use spec tennis as a building block. So let's say you don't know how to hit a topspin forehand. You would be able to more successfully and also more quickly learn how to hit a topspin forehand in spec tennis because the paddle is shorter and the ball has less variability in the bounce. So you end up with more balls in your strike zone, and that basically creates a better environment for success. So let's say you learn that topspin forehand in spec tennis, then you can directly translate that same swing to tennis, which you might not be able to do in other alternatives such as pickleball.
So, I mean, it's interesting. I watched a couple of the videos that you have on the Spec Tennis website, and the strokes in spec tennis do look very much like tennis strokes. The court is shorter, obviously, and the racket is a very different size and shape than a tennis racket. But the actual stroke production seems very similar.
Yes, exactly. And when I teach it, I teach the same exact concepts and techniques that I would in tennis.
So from your perspective as a tennis teacher and a spec tennis teacher, there's no difference in how you're teaching forehands, backhands. Is the serve the same? I didn't actually see serves. I just saw ground strokes.
Yeah, so you're sorry. Yes, you're correct. So I teach it the same way. In terms of the serve in spec tennis, we use an underhand serve, but that's not to say that you can't use an overhand serve in spec tennis to train your tennis serve. And so I was sent a video the other day. I don't know if you know Sterling Strother. He's in North Carolina. So
I sure do.
He was training his son's tennis serve with spec tennis. They set up a nice court in their driveway. And so he sent me a video of some pretty high level points. I was impressed with his son's ability. And they were doing overhand serves the whole time. So the weight of the paddle compared to that of a tennis racket, it's not that heavy, but the weight is condensed into a smaller space. And I believe that forces better biomechanics. And so, for example, with a lot of tennis rackets, you can make the ball over the net with using just your arm or maybe your wrist. But in spec tennis, it naturally feels like you need to turn your shoulders more and use your legs on the shot because the paddle is a lot less powerful. And so this naturally assists with good technical development. And so the same thing would be true on something like the serve. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I answered your total question. Sorry if I got off topic there.
No. I think that's helpful to hear. I'm still, struggling with the idea of needing to buy different equipment. If the goal is to improve tennis, why wouldn't you just progress through, the red, orange, green progression to develop the strokes and technique and shots and things like that, rather than having to have a different type of racket or paddle in order to do that. And I get I get spec tennis as its own entity, but still having trouble understanding the transition from spec tennis to regular tennis for a junior player, let's say, just getting started in the game. I understand it a little bit better with an adult audience.
Yeah, no, that's another great question. So I think that the ROGY program is designed in a great way, but I don't think that everyone follows it the way they should. So I've seen over the years plenty of players that will be training with the correct ball, but then when they go out with their parents train them with the yellow ball, for example. And so I think that takes them a step backwards in their development. They should be doing everything with the orange ball on the 60-foot court, for example, based on their height and their skill level and their tennis age. But then maybe the parent hinders that success a bit. So I find that with spec tennis, it's very fun for the parents to play. The parent doesn't have to be that good to be able to control the ball with the kid. You see a lot of parents go out there and practice with a kid with the transition ball on maybe a small court, but they use their adult size racket. They can't take a full swing at the ball and keep it in the court maybe because they're not a regular tennis player. Or if they do, it's just creating a situation that's too difficult for their child to practice in. I've also found that with practicing, spec tennis leads to less arguments between the parent and kid, because I think the number one thing that happens when families go out and practice is they mean well, but unless the player's like a really high level junior, the moment that the child starts not being able to complete the task that the parent sets out for them, then the parent kind of begins coaching them, which unless they're educated on how to be a good tennis parent and ways that they can supplement the tennis pro's coaching or whoever's coaching that kid in a professional capacity, I find that they can actually kind of hinder the success of the kid. So with spec tennis, with the ability to have longer rallies and have more success, I find that just kind of accelerates the development process of the player.
Gotcha. Are you finding that players have any type of challenge switching from a spec tennis paddle to a regular tennis racket? Obviously the length of the racket is very different. The weight distribution's different, etc.
I don't. I think it's just all really in the mindset. I mean, it's almost as if I just played ping pong and now I'm going to go play tennis, so I have to adapt to the different size equipment. And especially for kids, I mean, they pick things up so easily. So you could have them playing spec tennis in one point and tennis in the next point, and you wouldn't even notice a difference in terms of them needing to warm up with one or the other.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, how widespread is spec tennis? You contacted me, just recently, and so I'm new to learning about this, and I'm not real familiar with it, which is why we're having this conversation, hopefully introducing others to what you're out there doing, which I think is, the point of this podcast is to get information out. But, is this something, obviously you said Sterling sent you video of using it at his home. Is it in clubs? Is it something that's being done in parks? Are people creating makeshift spec tennis courts? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, so I actually started it in 2016. And at that time, I was teaching tennis full time, so just promoting it in my free time. But then within the last 6 to 9 months, I've cut back the tennis coaching role and have been able to spend more time growing and promoting it. And so it's being played in about half of the U.S. states now. It's being played in a number of clubs. And for example, in Texas, it was introduced at the Clubs of Kingwood in Houston, which is owned by Club Corp. And then they put an article out about spec tennis. And then suddenly I had a bunch of Club Corp clubs contacting me to get it started there. So it varies with how much it's grown in the various areas of the country. But I would say there's upwards of 1,000 players now. And especially during the quarantine. It's become quite popular because a lot of people have been able to set it up in their driveway or in the street. I've even done some videos of me playing in the house, and it's fun because you're not gonna damage something with the ball, with that soft ball. So you can do a lot of reflex volleys and things like that. And you really don't need the full court space to be able to have fun with it. So I get that question all the time, like you, kind of similar to what you asked me, like why not just play tennis outside in the street or driveway? And then my answer is always, well, I mean, you can, but you're kind of limited as to what you can do. You have to probably, most people don't have the size or space to stand back 78 feet and be able to rally the ball back and forth. But here you can take a full swing at the ball using your exact strokes that you would use in tennis or spec tennis, and you don't even need that much space to be able to do it. Even if you don't have a net, it can still be pretty fun.
Is there already a competitive structure set up, like a tournament structure set up for spec tennis, or is that something that is in the works? Or are you looking for this just to remain a recreational type sport?
That's in the works. I've been running tournaments here in Northern California, about 2 tournaments a year. And I've started running leagues this past summer, and so those have been quite a lot of fun. The majority of players are tennis players, but that's not to say that there aren't, it doesn't attract new players to the sport as well. So I've got new players who you kind of look at them and you don't think they would ever be a tennis player. And they get out on the spec tennis court and they have a lot of fun and success that they might not have been able to have on the tennis court.
Mm-hmm. And can you talk about the rules for spec tennis, the scoring and all of that?
Yes, absolutely. So the scoring is no ad tennis scoring. So you play first to 4 points wins a game. First to 4 games wins a set. So it's a short set. And then depending on the format, you could play 2 out of 3 or even 3 out of 5 sets. You only get one serve, and it's underhand cross court, which can be either off the bounce or out of your hand. And so that in itself, I believe, breaks down a lot of barriers, especially when watching juniors playing in their first matches. It's a very high pressure situation. So I've coached like a 10 and under orange ball team before. Many of these players have never played a match before, and you get them out there playing doubles and they have to deal with an overhand serve, and they maybe have just only started learning how to hit an overhand serve. That can be a very kind of painful and frustrating experience for both the kids and the parents. But just breaking down that barrier of just allowing them to hit that underhand serve in spec tennis at least gets the rally started. And then the pace, the ball's coming slower with the less powerful paddle, so the rallies end up being longer. So I could see it becoming a very successful thing in something like the junior team tennis pathway as well.
Okay, and in terms of rules of the sport, are they just typical tennis rules?
Yeah, typical tennis rules. You're allowed to serve and volley. You have to let the return bounce just like you would in tennis, so you can't volley the serve return. And then you would play just like you would in tennis. So often there's a one at the net, one at the baseline to start the point. You can also play 2 at the net once the point starts. The server has to stand in the corner of the court and 4 feet back. So in competition, there's actually a mark that's 4 feet from the intersection of the baseline and sideline. And the reason for that is it just makes it a little more challenging to serve and volley, so that you're not able to get right on top of the net for that first volley and have a high volley.
Gotcha. And what about, other rules of tennis that apply? Things like servelets or, I don't know. I'm trying to think, of other things that would apply on a short court.
So servelets are played just like in Division I men's tennis. So if it hits the net and goes cross court, then it counts. And then in terms of switching sides of the court, you switch after every set. So the sets happen really quick. There's very limited time in between points, even though you're allowed the 25 seconds, because the balls are just contained in that small area for the most part. So after the point's done, the ball gets passed back to the server. You only get one serve, so there's no time spent picking up the missed first serve. And so you can play a set in 15 minutes and feel like you've gotten a great workout in that short amount of time.
Gotcha. And what about in terms of coaching? Because, as we know in junior tennis, except at certain events, coaching is not allowed during competitive play. But it seems to me that if spec tennis is going to be used as kind of an entry or a gateway to competitive tennis for junior players, that this would be a great opportunity for coaching to be part of the whole picture.
Yes, I totally agree. And hopefully it gets to that stage someday. And I'll gladly welcome the coaching because, I think that's, like you said, that's part of the learning experience. And one of the things that I think is a huge benefit even for high-level tennis players, using spec tennis to train their patterns and tactics. I don't know if you're familiar with futsal that they've played in Brazil. So
absolutely.
Many people credit the Brazilian national team of winning some World Cups because a lot of their players grew up playing futsal. And for people who don't know what that is, I myself am not that familiar with it, but from what I've heard, it's basically indoor soccer on a smaller field. And by creating a smaller space where players have to play inside of, that makes them more precise. And so the same thing with spec tennis. So by creating this smaller space where they have to train in, they increase their precision. And then when you move them back to a bigger court, they often still use that smaller space because they've been training in it. And so that reduces their unforced errors. And for a lot of kids especially, it's hard to see visually the patterns on a larger court. They can be seen much more easily on this smaller court. And so I find that's one way that players can really benefit from this. And then adding to that, many players, especially juniors, don't like coming to the net. So it's hard to develop an all-court game in this day and age of modern tennis. But in spec tennis, you'll find that players naturally gravitate to the net a lot more often. And with that soft ball coming at you, there's no fear of getting hit with the ball the same way there is in tennis. It's also harder to lob over somebody's head or hit a clean winner passing shot. And so all around, it just kind of opens the door up for molding a tennis player into whatever game style would best suit them.
A lot of the things that you're saying are the arguments that have been used for the red, orange, green pathway in junior tennis. Smaller court, giving the player more control, teaching them to come forward, teaching them how to, use angles and really use the geometry of the court. So again, I just, I'm trying to understand why someone would choose spec tennis as opposed to the red, orange, green route for a developing young player. And again, I hear what you're saying about adult players and using spec tennis for adult players and why psychologically it makes sense. But I'm still having a hard time understanding with the juniors why you would choose spec tennis as opposed to the red, orange, green pathway. And what am I missing?
So I don't think that people should choose it instead of the red, orange, green pathway, but I think it can be a supplement. Now it depends on what the coach's philosophy is. Obviously, some people don't use the red, orange, green, yellow philosophy. And so if they wanted to implement spec tennis, it would be a supplement to their whatever pathway they have. But I find that with the red, orange, green, yellow pathway, once you have moved to the next ball, you don't usually come back. And so I think that can be detrimental to development because there's a lot of things that you can do with a slower ball that would benefit you. But once you've graduated from orange ball, for example, and you're playing green ball, you don't feel like you want to go back and do anything with the orange ball. It's kind of like, I think a lot of people treat it like karate, where your success is measured by what ball you're playing. And so people are hesitant to do any sort of training, like they feel like they're taking a step backwards. Mm-hmm. Whereas with spec tennis, with it being its own entity as well, you can use it as cross training your whole tennis career and not feel like you're taking a step backwards, even though you and I both know that, if a coach says, we have 14-year-old players that are playing yellow ball and they're playing national tournaments, and let's go out and do this reflex volley drill with the orange ball, the coach understands why they're going to do that drill, and maybe the players can as well. But for a lot of people, they try to get through the red, orange, green, yellow as fast as possible. I think because they see their peers maybe moving up faster. They want to play like the pros. And so, unfortunately, I think there's not a lot coming back to it.
Gotcha. Is there a difference in coaching spec tennis versus coaching traditional tennis?
Well, it depends on the coaching philosophy. For myself, I like to think of everything as a progression. And so I'll start with a simple skill and make that skill more complex as the player is able to do it. And so I think that there isn't a difference in coaching philosophy if you're already using progressions. If you don't use progressions in your coaching, then it might be something a little bit different, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think of every skill in spec tennis as being simpler than every skill in tennis. And so if a player is struggling, then you can regress them back to spec tennis, and they don't feel that they don't have that same feeling that I'm doing bad, and so the coach is making me move backwards. It's just they're doing something different to try to achieve the same goal.
So are you seeing a lot of crossover where coaches are traditional tennis coaches, but they're bringing in spec tennis to either teach a new skill or to really hone in on a specific skill, as opposed to using it as a separate sport? It's more of a training mechanism.
Yeah, there's a lot of both, and I think it depends on just what situation the coach is in, whether they have their own program or whether they're at a club or maybe a public facility. Kind of depends on what capacity they use it. A lot of coaches are using it as a way to attract new players. Like you said earlier, with pickleball, I think that is actually grabbing a lot of players away from tennis that could potentially play tennis. I saw something the other day that there's 16 million people interested in tennis, but I think it's becoming harder and harder to get into tennis because of, like you said, it's so easy to go out, and pickleball has this such inviting feeling where anybody sees you sitting on the side on the bench and they invite you out to the court. So it's very easy to grow something like that and get people hooked without having to take thousands of dollars of private lessons. And so,
but tennis used to be like that. Tennis used to feel that exact same way, and it just doesn't anymore for a myriad of reasons. But, I'm a tennis person. I mean, that's the world I run in, and I love tennis. And so I want to see tennis continue to grow and thrive, and yes, learn from other sports and figure out how to do things that make it inviting again. But I don't want to see people leave tennis to go to other sports because they're either, easier to play, or have easier access. I want tennis to be easy to play and have easy access. And to me, that's where I see spec tennis really being a contributor to that, where a coach could be a tennis coach, but utilizing spec tennis as a way to really enhance the way they teach.
Yeah, exactly. And I think obviously you introduce somebody something new, maybe a small percentage of them just stick with that and don't get to the often end goal, which is to have them become good tennis players. But for example, if I'm teaching a ladies doubles clinic and we want to work on poaching, which is an advanced skill, it's hard to do. Let's say I have a 3.0 ladies clinic. It's hard to do in that capacity on a tennis court without handicapping people or modifying starting positions. Whereas in spec tennis, if you do that same drill nearly every ball is poachable because it's such a shorter distance for the net player to go to be able to cover it. If they leave early, leave at the wrong time, the rally still probably continues because their baseline partner can cover them. And then it's also great practice for the opposing net player who's practicing defending against the poach. And so you can often take a skill like that you feel like you want to improve, but it's just hard to do on the larger court in the faster capacity, depending on the skill level, and really build their confidence in it. So then when you switch back to the tennis court, they already have a better understanding of what they're trying to do. Another great example that I like to use is if you're doing like a lob to overhead game with, let's say, that same 3.0 ladies group. Whenever I do that drill in tennis, the rallies are very short. So what happens is either the overhead is made and then the point ends, the baseline team can't retrieve the next ball as a lob, or maybe the lob goes over the net player's head. So that's discouraging for the person trying to hit overheads because they're not getting a lot of reps. And so by doing that same game in spec tennis, there's less lobs that go over the player's head. More overheads are returnable because it's coming at a slower pace. And so everybody's just getting more practice and it's a lot easier to keep the kind of the morale up. There's many drills in tennis that you do, and before you do them, you know that the players need to work on this skill, but you try to find a way to keep them engaged or keep the rotations happening quick because you know that the drill is not going to be their favorite drill of all time, like due to the difficulty level.
Gotcha. What am I not asking that I should be asking and that you want the Parenting Aces audience to know?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I just think that, I think that you have a very open mind about this. And I think if you try spec tennis, I think most people really enjoy playing it. Depending on, no matter what capacity you play it in, I think that everybody can the majority of people can get a benefit from it. So whether it's just you want to have something different than tennis, I know a lot of junior players, especially nowadays with how competitive it is, they're playing tennis maybe 5 days a week. And so it's nice to just have something as a change that can still benefit your tennis game. When I would go to tournaments as a junior and in college, like you always see there's always those players that are they're friends and they're hanging out at the tournament in between matches. They're waiting for their match and they're playing some form of tennis, and it usually is this game. It's some form of mini tennis game.
Right.
Like you get strikes, and the loser has to like sit at the service line, and the other guy tries to hit him with a serve or something like that. It's usually some form of that, or the game where you hit the ball into the ground on your side, and then it has to go over to your opponent's side. So they're always playing these games that are just fun for them, and I think spec tennis is something like that. So I mean, I could see players at a tournament, like if you had the choice, like, hey, do you want to go out and practice tennis or do you want to go out and play this? Like they're gonna gravitate towards the paddle. It's so fun, especially for a higher level player. You can just absolutely rip the ball, and it doesn't go that fast, and the other player can get it back. And so you create these pro-like points, especially in singles, that are hard to duplicate in tennis. And so I think everybody, if they don't see it as like a threat to tennis, if they just embrace the fact that I think it's all good for tennis, I think you can get a lot out of it.
I'm also, just thinking about the family where the junior player has gotten to a stage where they're too good to be on the court with their siblings or their parents. It's just not fun, but maybe spec tennis is something they can continue to do as a family, where everybody's on a more level playing field, so to speak.
Yes, exactly. So mixing levels works great. And so I've done a lot of events at clubs that I've worked at where you can mix parents and kids together in like a round robin format, and everybody is just kind of on an even playing field, like you said, because there's less ability to, you can hit the ball hard, but it doesn't come that hard off the paddle. due to the low compression ball. So every ball is more manageable, which makes it easier for lower level players to kind of hang in there with higher level players. So like you said, going out with your family, that can be a disaster if you have a high level junior and the parents and maybe the other sibling isn't at that level, especially if the high level junior doesn't understand the concept of, playing cooperative, fun family tennis, and just ripping the ball like you would in a match. That can be not the best experience, but if you did the same thing in spec tennis, it's a lot of fun.
Gotcha. So if people want more information, how do they find out about spec tennis?
So spectennis.com is the best resource, SPEC tennis.com. And then on there are links to where you can get paddles and things like that. But you can also send me an email personally, which is spectennis@yahoo.com. And I'm happy to chat with anybody on the phone or over email and give you more information, see if it's something that you'd like to implement, whether you're being a coach or a parent of a junior player, see if it's something that might be helpful for you.
Fantastic. And we'll have those links in the show notes on parentingaces.com. So for my listeners, don't worry. There'll be live links. You can just click and get in touch with Nate directly. Nate, it's been interesting to learn about this new racket sport out there, spec tennis, and I really appreciate you taking time to share your story with Parenting Aces.
Oh, thanks so much, Lisa. Really appreciate it. You have such a great show.
Thanks so much. And to my listeners, thanks so much for tuning in, and we will catch you next time on Parenting Aces. I'm Lisa Stone, and you've been listening to the Parenting Aces podcast. For tennis parents, by a tennis parent. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to us and write a review on iTunes. For more information on navigating the junior and college tennis journey, please visit us online at parentingaces.com. Thanks for tuning in and sharing us with your tennis community.